There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Back in the first few decades of the 19th century, people were fascinated and a little afraid of great apes, especially the orangutans. Orangutan means man of the forest, and people couldn't look at them without feeling a little bit of unease. At times, they looked almost, human. In 1838, the London Zoo had an orangutan on exhibit named Jenny. Jenny was a popular attraction. She played, she sulked, and she did everything else a human child would do, except, of course, to talk. One person who was fascinated by her was Charles Darwin. On March 28, 1838, Darwin paid a visit to Jenny. He wanted to see for himself, up close, what all of the fuss was about. He wrote about it to his sister.
The keeper showed her an apple, but would not give it her, whereupon she threw herself on her back, kicked and cried precisely like a naughty child. She then looked very sulky, and after 2 or 3 fits of passion, the keeper said, "Jenny, if you will stop bawling and be a good girl, I will give you the apple."
Darwin was amused and even taken with Jenny. For him, and probably only him, it was like looking back through time and shaking hands with a long-distant relative.
She certainly understood every word of this. And, though like a child, she had great work to stop whinging, she at last succeeded, and then got the apple, with which she jumped into an armchair and began eating it, with the most contented countenance imaginable.
Orangutans and the other great apes were mysterious to us. They lived in jungles while we built cities. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck had a sneaking suspicion that they were our ancestors. Now you can imagine how well that one went over. As with many of Lamarck's theories, people weren't ready to listen. And Darwin was, though. He was convinced of the relationship, especially after his encounter with Jenny. He wasn't of the mind that they were an early human ancestor, but he was sure that we shared a common ancestor. Jenny exhibited behaviors much like a human child would. And it wasn't a case of mimicry. It was because, at some point in the distant past, our mutual ancestor had displayed the same behaviors. We are a lot alike. One could say that we are just hairless apes. As a species, we are obsessed with hair. We cut it, we groom it, we gel it, shave it, and we stress over it when we lose it. As a culture, we spend thousands of dollars every year to support a billion-dollar industry. Now, if you have straight hair, you might pay to make it curly, or you might even pay to change your hair's color. Now, those of us with curly hair sometimes wish it were straight. We have bedheads, hat heads, and bad hair days. We envy those whose hair is always perfect, or those who seem not to care but still manage to look good. Facial hair goes in and out of style. I go back and forth between a goatee, 5 o'clock shadow, and simply shaving it all off. My wife likes the facial hair, and I'm undecided, so I pretty much just follow her advice. If you do a quick search on Google for the average amount of hair on the human head, you'll come up with numbers anywhere between 90,000 and 150,000 strands of hair. Now, 100,000 seems to be the most popular number. The follically challenged members of our society have a lot less than that, and they hand over their paychecks trying to get it back. Now, here's some fun facts about human hair. Do you know why we have eyebrows? One theory is that it keeps the sweat out of our eyes. Now, I can see the advantage to that. On hot days in the savannah, it would have served a purpose when a predator came calling. Now, if your eyes are blurred with sweat, well, let's just say you won't see what's coming. Now, our eyebrow hair sheds every 5 months. So do your eyelashes. And when you compare the number of hair follicles on our bodies to our closest relative, the chimpanzee, it's roughly the same. They appear hairier because their hair grows longer. At least their body hair does. We're the ones who are gifted or cursed with long hair on top of our heads. But why? If chimps are our closest relative, why aren't we hairy like they are? Not that we want to be, but Evolutionary speaking, why is it that we shed our hair at some point in the distant past? And for what purpose? Now, I'm sure given time you can come up with a few ideas of your own. Just imagine what the benefits might be for, say, a slight mutation, one that results in less hair, to be advantageous. Could it be for wind resistance? To allow you to maybe run a little bit faster? Or might it be for looks and a healthy dose of sexual selection thrown in? Or might it just be a little bit more mundane, like staying cool? Now think about it. Imagine how hot it must have been on the savannah after our ancestors left the safety of the trees to hunt for food. Homo erectus did this almost 2 million years ago. They made their homes on the savannas. They ran, they played, and they hunted, and they fought for survival. And one of the byproducts of all of that activity is sweat. Now, wouldn't it be a benefit to have less hair and less sweat? Still, the great apes have hair today, though. They didn't shed theirs. And then again, they tend to prefer the cooler climates of the jungles. But this is the problem when you start comparing. Just because one branch of a family tree suffered or benefited from a mutation doesn't mean the other branches did also. Another branch may never even experience the mutation. We may have gradually lost our hair, and it may have been advantageous to us, and it may have also been advantageous to chimpanzees had they experienced the same mutation. The thing is, they didn't. And there's another theory out there that it all has to do with the amount of time it takes us to mature. Hair growth really kicks in when we hit puberty. And maybe that trait, that prepubescent trait, stays with us into adulthood. It's worth noting that chimpanzees also take a long time to hit puberty. They're pretty much the same as us, and they are right behind us when it comes to being the less hairy hominid. Or maybe it's because of water. Now, it wasn't fair for me to start in with the Twilight Zone music. Once you hear the theory, you'll understand why. It's not a popular theory, but in its own strange little way, it actually makes sense. But making sense and being right are two completely different things. Let me present you with the aquatic ape hypothesis. Now, let that sink in. Actually, I'll give you a moment to come up with your own theory as to what the aquatic ape hypothesis entails. Okay, time's up. So the aquatic ape hypothesis is this. We, and by we I mean our ancient ancestors, we climbed out of the trees and we began to hunt the land.
I think up until now all the answers have been wrong and inadequate. Most of them have hinged around the theory that man was a carnivorous ape who came from the trees to the savannah, and the male became a mighty hunter, and a killer, and a weapon wielder, and the female became a parasite and a sexual object. And this is supposed to explain all the differences between ourselves and the other apes. It doesn't explain them, it's inadequate, it contains dozens of inconsistencies, it leaves dozens of questions unanswered.
And that's writer Elaine Morgan. She fell under the spell of this theory when she first heard it and never let it go. You could say she was the theory's greatest champion, just like Huxley was for Darwin.
I believe they passed through a period of living in a semi-aquatic environment, and this was what set us on the road to becoming fully human.
Instead of staying in the heat of the savannah, our ancestors, according to this theory, started to hang out by the sea where it was much cooler. There, they gradually learned how to swim and to dive for fish. Now, imagine putting on a fur coat and diving into a pool. Not fun, right? Well, now you can see why it would be a good thing to lose the hair. Wet hair is heavy. Trying to swim with a body covered in wet hair is hazardous. Another thing that the theory proposes is that bipedalism might have evolved to help us wade into the shallows and to hunt for food. And do you know how your fingers and toes wrinkle after being in the water for an extended period of time? It's a response brought on by your sympathetic nervous system. A holdover, the theory goes, from our aquatic days. Elaine Morgan didn't make this up. I mentioned that she fell herself under the theory's spell. It was first mentioned by Max Westenhofer, a German pathologist. He felt that much of what he saw in modern humans was the result of evolution acting on a sea-dwelling species before we found our way back onto the land. Now, if you're thinking mermaids, that's not what Westenhofer was suggesting. Now, if you've been a long-time listener of the show, you might recall that Benoit de Maillet thought this very thing back in the early 18th century. Just look for the episode titled Of Mermaids and Men. So, Max Westenhofer was the first that we know of to suggest that we lost our long body hair due to time spent in the sea. Now, this was later picked up by marine biologist Sir Alister Hardy in the 1960s, as well as by Desmond Morris, who mentioned it in his 1967 book, The Naked Ape. Now, Morris wasn't a staunch advocate of the idea, but he does mention it.
We can trace our ancestry back for over 3 million years, and we can see how those ape men turned into modern men. But back in that very early formative stage, that's when the picture becomes vague. Why did we shed our coat of fur, stand up on our hind legs, and start to talk?
Now, that's Desmond Morris himself. He imagined an early form of human wading into the water, looking for food, and perhaps realizing that they were good at it.
It's thought that there might have been a vital intermediate stage. Instead of coming out of the forest and straight onto the open grasslands, the idea is that our remote ancestors went instead to the water's edge. There they went more and more into the water, becoming what you might almost call an aquatic ape.
In 1997, Elaine Morgan herself published a book on the subject titled, appropriately enough, The Aquatic Ape Hypothesis. In it, she presented a compelling case. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the side you sit on, science requires evidence. The aquatic ape hypothesis remains to this day just that, a hypothesis. Now here's one for you, a completely different approach. This one comes by way of a study performed by a team led by Professor Michael Sivajathy of Sheffield University. What the team asked was not why we no longer sport long hairs on our bodies, but why we still have hairs at all. The fine hairs we do have must be good for something. So they recruited volunteers at the university by using Facebook. Once they had their volunteers, 29 to be exact, they shaved some hair from an arm of each of the volunteers. They then placed bedbugs on the unshaved hairy arm and also near the hairless patch. Now, what do you think they found? Now, if you guessed that the hairless patch was the perfect feeding spot for the bugs, you're correct. The researchers didn't let the bugs hunker down and start feeding, they took them right off. But this proved point number one. It didn't take long for the bugs to find a feeding spot when there were bare patches. As far as the hairier arms are concerned, not only did it take the bugs a little bit longer, but the volunteers were better able to sense that they were there. Our tiny hairs serve as little detection devices. Think of them like parasite detection devices. This points to an evolutionary advantage for retaining our short body hair. In the distant past, it could be that females of our species preferred mates who had less parasites on them. In a roundabout way, this might even explain why hair became shorter. When you consider it, long hair may be detrimental to detection. Having short hair enhances detection. The nerve cells on our skin sense the movement of the hair as well as the tiny feet touching our skin. Now, how many times have you been somewhere and felt something on your leg or your arm? You might have never felt it if your hair were a few inches longer. Now, I have naturally curly hair. I hated it when I was younger. Curly hair seems to have a mind of its own. I've grown used to it. A friend of mine, though, he shaves his head bald. It looks good on him, but he has to wear a knit cap as soon as the temperature drops. I, on the other hand, can hold out a little bit longer. I don't lose as much body heat because of the hair on my head. That might just explain why we still have hair on top of our heads. I'm going to end the episode with this. It's a quote from an old song from the 1960s. I want it long, straight, curly, fuzzy, snaggy, shaggy, ratty, matty. Evolution Talk is written and produced by myself, Rick Coast. The music on this episode was composed and performed by Poddington Bear. Support for Evolution Talk comes from you, simply by listening. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can always reach me by using the site's contact page or on Twitter, where you can find me at Rick Coast. And most of all, thank you for listening. And until next time, please take care of yourself.
For more than 6,000 years, the art of cutting hair has been practiced as a craft. In ancient Egypt, barbers trimmed the square-cut beards of the pharaohs.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.